Sure. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. And we have a great session planned. I'm really pleased to have our panelists today and to bring this to you. We'll have three, just so you know, we'll have three random words that I'm going to say during the webinar. Write them down. At the end of the session, Alma will be sending out a little survey. You identify which words I said, and then that allows the Bar Association to track who was in the session in order to give CLE credit. So if you can write the crazy words down, I'm going to start with light. Light. There you go. There's your word one. So the other thing I want to say is to thank Alma for being my trusty partner in putting all of these together and making this happen. We're also planning at the end of the session to have time for questions. So if you can put your questions in the chat, we'll answer those at the end of the session. I also ask that you please leave the chat, not to add discussions or comments in the chat, just to have that for questions. It's going to be easier for us to identify the questions at the end of the session. So thank you very much, and here we go. Here we go. Now we're not. There we go. So Kwixuan and Deborah are here with us today. Kwixuan has spent the last 19 years at the Public Defender's Office in San Francisco. He's held many different leadership roles. Currently, he's the head of the head attorney of the homicide unit. He brings a wealth of knowledge and experience on the justice system to us. I'm really happy that he's here. He's a professor at several law schools in the Bay Area. He's received many awards, including the Minority Bar Coalition's Unity Award for outstanding service in to the community. So thank you, Kwixuan, for being here. Deborah, as many of you know, is your executive director of the San Mateo County Bar Association. She's been with the bar for 15 years. The last 4, she's held the role of executive director. Deborah volunteers her time helping children in underserved populations, as well as mentoring and creating network opportunities for others. I'm Diane Camacho. I run DLC Consulting Services after about 30 years in law firms, primarily in management roles. I started my own company in 2013, and we bring operational management and back office services to solo and small law firms. And I've been working with the San Mateo County Bar to bring these monthly practice management sessions. I speak at other attorney and paralegal associations, and I teach at the paralegal program at San Francisco State University. Today we're going to talk about what has happened in our lifetimes to shape us, to create our values, and we're going to talk about racial disparity in the criminal justice arena. We're going to also talk about some personal experiences of our panelists, and then we're going to have some time at the end for questions. And Alma, if you would share.
Absolutely.
assume are good people. And some I assume are good people. And some I assume are good people.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Segregation forever. Segregation forever.
You should ask yourself who taught you to hate being what God gave you. Who taught you? Who taught you?
How would you like to go to work for me? Yeah.
Unsafe, unprotected, subterranean, violent, hated for who you are. You become so scared that you defer to the powers that be, and you're willing to consent to your own domination. And that's the history of black people in America. That's the history of black people in America. Anytime you look the terror in the face, what's going on? Who really cares? Save the babies. What's happening, brother? And we live now in revolutionary times, but the counter-revolution is winning. But the counter-revolution is winning. But the counter-revolution is winning.
Dunn told investigators he believed he saw 4 inches of a shotgun. Demonstrators were on the street. A week since Michael Brown was shot multiple times.
Freed by a judge just moments before, after 35 years in prison. After 35 years in prison.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a timeline of, normally I do this so it's the generations in the workplace. So we're going to start from the traditionalists, and I'm going to walk you through a timeline of events for the United States primarily, a little bit about family and about the events in the US. And we need to kind of look at the good and the bad. When we think about understanding each other and having empathy and working with others and being in a society with others, we need to remember that they have different experiences and they have a different background than we do. A lot of times these are called signposts, and what they are is things that have happened during formative years for each of us. And formative years, you know, 10 to 20 maybe, all of this is kind of a little bit flexing. These dates might not be exactly the dates that you've seen for generations. These are the dates that I use. These are the ages that I use. And it's about this time. And when we're about 10, we start realizing that there are things outside of our family, and we start absorbing things. And this starts adding to not only our personalities and our values and our norms, the outside world starts coming in, and we start adding that into who we are. Sometimes they're called signposts. Sometimes people say, well, it's the lens that they're looking through. But fundamentally, the world we grew up in forms our core values. And our memories of external events, like I said, start when we're about 10. So we're going to take a short walk through history for the past 90 years or so. This is primarily the people that are in the workforce and are in leadership roles. And I want you to think, while we're going through this session today, I want you to think about trust and the importance of trust in our society, in our families, in our work, and how important that is, and how the trust continues to deteriorate in our society, and it's bringing about some of the situations that we have going on right now. I've given this presentation for about the last 5 years, and when I was preparing for this session and adding the Black Lives Matter movement, I was embarrassedly I was aware of the fact that I did not include people of color in this session in the past 5 years. It was a timeline of my experience as a white middle-class woman in America. And if you go into a lot of the information on the web about what happened during the different generations and what goes on during the different generations, a lot of it is for middle-class white people. So I want to thank my panelists for helping me flesh this out, add some reality to it, and add their experiences to it. They were very open and honest and graceful in helping me add to this. So we're going to start with the traditionalists. And the traditionalists are 75 to 92. They were born around 28 to 45. They're still in leadership roles, as we know. We're hoping that they retire sometimes sooner than they do, but they are in leadership roles. This is a relatively small generation due to the Depression, so there aren't as many traditionalists as there are, say, baby boomers and the more current generations. This generation was very hierarchical in roles in the family. You know, dad was boss and you did what dad said. In business, there was always corporate structure. In the military and in society as a whole, there were almost caste systems in our society that we're trying to tear down now. Roosevelt, coming out of the Depression, was spending and building roads, schools. NASA became an organization then. This is also considered the silent generation because, as many of us remember, children were supposed to be seen and not heard, and we didn't have a voice. That is very different than what happens now. There was some two different migrations, the Great Migrations. The first one was the Dust Bowl migration, the quote Okies. So about 2.5 million people migrated out of Texas and New Mexico, Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma during the 30s. And about 250,000 ended up in California, a lot of them in the Central Valley. And I think many of us in California know the term Okie, and it wasn't always a fun, hip way to identify yourself. It wasn't, again, it was a negative slang. The other great migration lasted longer, but it was going on during this time. It started in 1916 and went through about 1970. And that was 6 million African Americans migrating out of the South, looking for better conditions, more opportunities, and getting away from the oppression of the South. The Fair Employment Act was brought to bear in 1941, and it gave equal treatment and training of all employees by defense contractors. So this was started out only for defense contractors. We also had in 1943 Detroit race riots. People were competing for jobs. There was a lot of migration from the South for whites and blacks. There was a return of the servicemen, and they were migrating to Detroit for a lot of the factory jobs and the automobile industry. The blacks only lived in one area, which we all kind of understand. I remember talking to my mother-in-law who, they're Puerto Rican, she was a migrant farm worker, and my husband grew up in San Lorenzo, which many of you know, and it basically was a big housing tract, a bunch of different housing tracts. And I was shocked to hear that their home association bylaws prohibited African Americans from moving into San Lorenzo. So it wasn't happening just in Detroit. It wasn't happening just in San Francisco. It was happening all over in the suburbs, and up until, well, the 50s, 60s, it was happening in San Lorenzo. So in Detroit, what was happening was there were the African-American black community was overpopulated, and the city attempted to expand into a white neighborhood, and that kind of started the hostilities between the whites wanting, not wanting the blacks there, the whites feeling like the blacks were taking their jobs, and all of that kind of thing. So there was a lot of tension, and a riot broke out. It broke out in a park, actually. It ended up having 6,000 Army troops and tanks brought in. There were 9 whites that were killed, 25 blacks that were killed, 17 blacks were killed by police, and no whites were killed by police that was reported. That was the riot of 1943. And it was more of a catalyst, another catalyst for the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement starts around this time too. Jesse Owens, who is the first black athlete that is a role model, won the gold medal in the 1936 Olympics. And then we had the beginning of World War II and the Japanese internment camps on the West Coast. We had, between 1942 and 1946 internment camps, any person with 1/16 of Japanese blood was put into, or could be put into, an internment camp. And this happened after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and they were, 90% of them were American citizens and born on American soil, but they were put into internment camps. Then we move into the baby boomers, and the baby boomers were a more independent generation. They wanted a little bit more autonomy and wanted to started having a voice. The children weren't all unheard. They talked about the latchkey kids during this period of time, and there were latchkey kids always. There were always working parents where kids were home by themselves, and the the term latchkey kid was coined during this period of time. And it's when kids came home from school and were by themselves. So for instance, myself, I would come home from school, nobody was here, I could do anything I wanted to do during that period of time. I just had to make sure that the house was clean and dinner was started by 6 o'clock when my parents got home. And they didn't really know what I was doing, and they trusted me, and they trusted the environment that I was going to be safe during that period of time. The consumer economy started during this period of time. Remember, at the end of World War II, people had more money. They were moving into what is called the suburbs now. These were, again, created, what I'm learning, primarily for white middle class people to get out of the cities and buy homes, cars, TVs, those kinds of things were, people had more money after the Depression. They were buying frivolous things. They weren't just trying to feed their families. And this also became the period of time with the highest divorce rate. It started escalating then, as well as women going back into the workforce. And again, there were always women in the workforce, but this is when women's rights started and more women went into the workforce. It spiked during that period of time. We were in a Cold War with Russia. We learned how to stop, drop, and cover, which was not going to be very helpful in the nuclear attack, but that was what we were taught because we thought that any moment Russia would bomb us. And McCarthy hearings, many of us know the McCarthy hearings where there were people accused of being communists, and there was a communist party in the United States, and there were people that were in the Communist Party, but it caused fear and, again, classified people as a threat, and many people were blacklisted from the film industry and other industries. And we also had what is called the hippie movement. It starts basically on college campuses, people looking for self-fulfillment. And again, remember, college campuses were primarily white people. They weren't a lot of, we aren't going to talk about segregation today, but again, it's the kind of hippie movement. There were people of color in it, but primarily white middle class. They were looking for self-fulfillment. The other thing that happened during this time was and I'm going to say this wrong, Barcero program. And this was a program where the United States made an agreement with Mexico so that we could have Mexican laborers starting in around 1942 due to the World War II and the men in the military. They had made an agreement so that Mexican men could come over and work in the agricultural business. So about 4.2 million Mexican males came over between 1942 and 1964 to work in the fields and our agricultural industry. Also, during this period of time, we had, with the migrant farm workers and the farm workers in general, Cesar Chavez became a hero for the Latino community and started the National Farm Workers Association in 1962. Jackie Robinson broke the barrier into professional sports during this period of time with the, as many of us know, the New York Dodgers. This was a period of time also after World War II, when we end World War II, of optimism. We won, we were the big boys in the world, and there was a lot of optimism for self-improvement and for making the American dream come true, if you will. So we were a pretty optimistic generation. Racial discrimination was banned during this period of time in the rail cars buses, armed forces, public schools, public parks and playgrounds. That was banned during this period of time. We also had some horrific things happening with Emmett Till. He was a 14-year-old African-American boy who was visiting Mississippi, and he was from Chicago and went into a family grocery store in Mississippi and was accused by a white woman of flirting with her and whistling at her. And after that happened, the day after that happened, he was abducted by her husband and his half-brother and brutally murdered and shot and mutilated and left for dead in the Tallahassee River. They found him 3 days later. They took him back to Chicago. His mother insisted that it was an open casket so that the world could see what had been done to her son and the brutality that was being done to the blacks during that period of time. Both men were found not guilty during the same year, and then a year later admitted to a reporter for Look magazine that they had done it. So this was a catalyst to the next phase of the civil rights movement. Kennedy was assassinated during this period of time in 1954. There was also an organization that was started in 1956 by the FBI. It was called it's Counterintelligence Program, and I don't know exactly how they said this acronym, but what it was an organization that was created to disrupt the American political organization. So they were surveying, they were infiltrating, discrediting, they were disrupting the political organizations. And it expanded, as oftentimes federal programs like this do, and to include the KKK and the Socialist Movement and the Black Panther Society. This also, in 1964, was the Freedom Summer Murders that happened in Mississippi. In 1963, Martin Luther King started the Freedom Walks, and that was his big Freedom Walk. So in the summer of 1964, there were a lot of freedom movements in the South, and 2 civil rights workers were abducted and murdered in 1964. One of the murderers was the co-founder of the White Knights and the Ku Klux Klan, and the other one was a deputy sheriff at the time. They both ended up being convicted eventually of these murders, again, spearing on the civil rights movement. We come on into the Generation X. This is many of us. Myself personally, I'm kind of on the cusp of Gen Y and Gen X, or I'm sorry, the previous generation and Gen X. I'm drawing a blank, baby boomers. And this starts the deterioration of U.S. leadership, if you will, finding out about Nixon and learning to distrust the government. It had been going on, obviously, in some communities, especially the oppressed communities, that the government and leadership wasn't taking care of them. But it became more widely known for all of us when Nixon was impeached during the Kent State student killings with the National Guard, where they killed 4 different people during this period of time. So the trust in the government kind of started waning more at this period of time. This was also when computer games kind of started coming into our households, Pong and all of that. And it was the first time that children were not going to exceed the affluence of their parents for the first time. So every generation, your children did better than you. Your children made more money, they had a better house, they had more opportunities. This is the first generation where that may not happen, and it's going to be more a level playing field. The Environmental Protection Agency was created during this time. Many of us remember the spotted owls in Oregon and the nuclear power plant situation, I don't even, debacle that was going on during this period of time. The Environmental Protection Agency was created. So we started thinking about what we were doing to our environment during this period of time. This was Woodstock in the hippies and free love and kind of finding ourselves was going on during this time. Again, thinking more of the white communities than the minority communities. And we went to the moon. So we were on top of the moon and top of the world in that regard. The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act happened during this period of time. The Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And the Voting Rights Act prohibited racial discrimination in voting. The EEOC was founded during this period of time. Miranda rights were developed also during this time. So the justice system was kind of playing a little bit of a role, and Kwixuan will talk a little bit more about that. The ironic thing that for me that I learned in the last week was the Summer of Love, which is many of us remember because that was when 200,000 again hippies descended on Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, and it was flowers and love and light and spiritualism. And also during this time was the Long Hot Summer, and that was again a riot that started in Detroit. It ended with 109 cities in the U.S. having race riots between April and July. The race riot in Detroit was spurred by poverty, joblessness, again in the African American community. It was basically an organization that was an after-hours club, and it was raided periodically by the police, and it was raided one night and 85 people were taken away, and that didn't really cause a problem. The problem was the onlookers that were in the streets watching this, and then they started throwing bottles and showing their dissatisfaction in the police, and that riot went on for 5 days. 43 people were killed, 7,000 people were arrested, and the National Guard was called in, paratroopers were dispatched, and again that season of riots was from April to July in 109 cities. That was 1967. Now Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, and Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. So that was in between them being assassinated. Deregulation, the government was busy deregulating everything, so they deregulated the airlines, banking, trucking, railroads, building that free market so that there would be greater competition and lower consumer rights. We all have our own opinion on how that worked. Then we move into Gen Y, and this is the generation that is 20 to 39 right now, and they were more sheltered. There was more fear. They weren't allowed to be latchkey kids as much. There were so now in the workforce they need more guidance. When you're talking to baby boomers, we don't want to be told what to do because you just tell us what needs to be done and we're going to take care of it. Gen Yers are more, tell me what to do. Remember that they had very scheduled days. They had camps and after and before school care and all of these different things. They needed more guidance. There were no losers in this generation, as we know. So it's very difficult for this generation to take criticism. We have to work on having them learn that criticism isn't necessarily a bad thing. So that's going on. We start, technology starts becoming a big part of their lives with cell phones and computers at home. Parents were laid off during the 80s, through 80 and 85. The big corporations like GE and AT&T had huge layoffs. Those corporations started bonusing the CEOs based on profitability, and the best way to make money is to lose employees. So that was huge. Again, we're looking at the distrust in the government. Now we can't trust the people that we've worked for the last 30 and 40 years. We see our parents being laid off. This generation wants to create their own destiny. They don't want anybody else to tell them what they should do. They want to kind of fix the world. And then we come into Gen Y, which are the people that are the youngest generation coming into the workplace. And they are the first generation that doesn't know a world, really doesn't understand a world before tech. They became they're very attached to their tech. This was a period of time that the crack and CIA, I don't know if anybody saw the series Snowfall, but that was when it was interesting, because then I started reading and realized that actually happened, that the CIA worked with the cartels, brought in drugs, turned the profits into buying guns and then giving them to the Contras in Nicaragua. So they brought the drugs into the Black communities in Los Angeles. So that's the crack capital of the world, and it was a deterioration of the whole society down there and spread out through the United States. The Firearm Protection Act happened in 1986, and this is sponsored by the NRA, and it gives more lenience for gun sellers, less oversight by the Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearm Department to regulate and audit. We remember the 1999 Columbine shooting, kind of the first horrific shooting of a child shooting children. In 1985, there was a 23-year-old gay black man that was hung in Concord at the Concord BART station, and I didn't even know about it. I lived in Concord, and I didn't even know about it until years later. I don't know, it must have been hushed up or something. It was one of those horrible things that we should all be aware of, but I wasn't. The Rodney King riots, the Oklahoma City bombing. Now that was a 2-year anniversary after Waco, the Timothy McVeigh debacle for the fight out with the police for in Waco, Texas, and the Olympic bombing, anti-terrorist, anti-abortion, anti-gay person bombed the Olympics, and we boycotted the Moscow Olympics, ironically, because they invaded Afghanistan. And then we wrap it up with these are more flexible family forms, so there are a lot more single families, mixed families than ever before. So the family is a different form than it was for the traditionalist society. They are more educated than ever, this generation. This generation is 52% non-Hispanic white, so that means 48% quote minorities. So obviously the minority is going away in minorities. This is 9/11 happened. There were, the fair wage laws are coming in, and the Me Too movement, paying women the equal wage as men as the fair wage laws. A Me Too movement is, we all know what these are. George Floyd, set off another awakening in a way. And then the Black Lives movement has been rolling strong and taking on a lot of our minds and our hearts, I think. Just two little slides I'm just going to flip through quickly because I'm running out of time. Gen Zs want a more activist government, and more Republicans are becoming, even the Republicans are saying that the blacks aren't treated fairly in the Gen Z generation. So we're kind of waking up. Black children still have less educated and have are still not going to college as much as other people. Asian have more parents that have gone to college. So we still have a lot to do. Basically what I'm saying is we still have a lot to do in the education for our youth. And I'm going to turn it over to Kwixuan, and he's going to talk about racial disparity in the criminal justice arena.
Yes, and thank you very much for having me. We are going to go through a number of slides showing the racial discrimination. Most of my talk is specifically about San Francisco and San Francisco stats, but I do have stats from across the country. So we can go to the next slide, please. So there are more Black men in prison today than were slaves in the 1800s, specifically, the 1850s. Currently, the prison population in the United States is close to 2.3 million. So we have a huge problem with prisoning our people. Next slide. In the 1860s, legislation was created that specifically created new crimes to keep slavery. The 13th Amendment reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crimes, shall exist." W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a statement which said, "Slaves went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back towards slavery." The laws were designed to reverse Blackization that organized efforts by white merchants, planners, businessmen, and politicians that followed the Reconstruction era. And the Redeemers employed vicious racial violence and state legislation as tools to prevent Black citizenship and equality promised under the 14th and 15th Amendments. Next slide, please. So this slide shows that just in the United States alone, we're talking about only Black males. So only Black males, just in the United States alone. The left column shows that there are 745,000 Black males in prison, incarcerated in the United States. This is more than the total population of 10 other countries. I'm talking about the total prison population. And that is India, Argentina, Lebanon, Canada, Japan, Germany, Finland, Israel, and England. So that just shows that there's something drastically wrong when we imprison just our African American population more than all these other 10 countries combined. And so before we do the next slide, I think we have a poll, and I want to ask a question, and that is, which states do you believe have the most incarcerated Black men? And you guys just click down. We'll give you guys about 10 seconds to click which states you believe have the most incarcerated Black men. And we'll do 10, 9, 8,
And they can click as
7.
many states as they like, right?
Yes, you can click as many states as you want. We're trying to find out which states you believe have the most incarceration for Black men. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's see what people picked. All right, so we have, whoa, California. People think California has the most at 69%. Looks like followed by Texas at 58%, followed by New York. And then we have people picked North Carolina, Oklahoma, and looks like the least is Wisconsin. 0 people picked Wisconsin. Interesting. Well, let's go to the next slide.
I'm sorry, I'm going to look like an idiot again. I think Kwixuan, you're frozen. So we can see where.
I think we're frozen.
There you go. You're open again, Kwixuan. Go.
Okay, there we go. Okay. All right. So sorry about that. I see that 0 people picked Wisconsin. The #1 worst state for incarceration of Black men is Wisconsin, believe it or not, with 12.8%, followed by Oklahoma, 9.7%. Then Iowa hits #3 at 9.4, tied with Pennsylvania, also at 9.4. California is #5 at 8.6%. Then there's Indiana at 8.4, Louisiana, a lot of people pick Louisiana, but it's #7 at 8.2%. Texas is actually #8 at 8.1%. Then Kansas at 7.7. And the last of the 10 is Colorado at 7.7%. So why is this happening? We go to the next slide. If incarceration rates continue to grow at the pace they have since the 1970s, 1 out of every 3 Black American males born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as can 1 of every 6 Latino males and 1 of every 17 white males. There was a study done in San Francisco that said, the racial biases in San Francisco start from the time of arrest and go throughout the entire criminal justice system all the way to the time of conviction. So why is that the case? And that's where we lead to implicit bias. Can we do the next slide, please? And this shows the San Francisco disparity gap. Again, it's for every 1 white person that was convicted, you had 10.3 Black convictions, 1.7 Latino convictions, and 0.5% of Asian Pacific Islander convictions. Next slide. So these are the California stats. Specifically in California, out of 100,000 people, you have a little over 1,100 Hispanics being incarcerated, 671 whites being incarcerated, and a whopping 5,525. California, as we know, is a very progressive state. It's a very liberal state, but we still are getting 5,525 African Americans incarcerated per 100,000. So how does that look for the other parts of the country? Well, let's look. Next slide. So this is the incarceration rate across the country for using the same 100,000. As you know, California was 5,000 African Americans being incarcerated. Nationwide is 2,207. Latinos is, it was a little over 1,100 in California, is under 1,000 nationwide. And then whites was 600 and something, and here nationwide is 380. So California is actually doing worse than the rest of the population combined. Next slide. So this is a chart that shows the overrepresentation of people of color in San Francisco. If we look at the far left corner of the chart, the very first column, that shows the population. So the white population is 45%, the Black population 6%, the Latino population 14%, and others 35%. The very next column is the arrest. So with the white population being 45%, it's 45% arrest, which makes sense. But that's where then you have a huge gap, the African-American population being 6%, but the African-American arrest a whopping 40%. And then we're going to the next column. Of those that were booked, of the 45% of the whites that were booked, 32, that were arrested, 32% actually get booked. Just because you're arrested, it doesn't mean you're booked. You can be arrested and then you can be released, but it drops. Of the 40% that were arrested for African Americans, 44% are booked, which means everybody's booked. If you're African American, you're gonna get booked. Or 44% of the bookies are African American. And then the next one is pretrial diversion, SFPDP, San Francisco Pretrial Diversion Project. It was at 59%, or is that 39% of the whites are eligible for pretrial diversion. 49% of the Blacks are eligible for pretrial diversion. And then finally, we go to the conviction rate, and it is 40% of the African Americans are convicted and 31% of whites are convicted. So why do we have the stats? If we look from the very beginning, the first column, 6% of the population is African American. Looking at the last column, 40% of the convictions are African American. Either you believe that African Americans are simply prone to violence and prone to committing crime, which I obviously don't believe, or there is something inherently wrong with our system. And let's go to the next slide. And that is why we discuss the science of implicit bias. It was 52 years ago when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated because he fought a system that openly discriminated against people of color. About 5 years before he was assassinated, he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which we all know so well. And in that speech, he said, one day, Black people will be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. That's what he said. But even today, 50 years later, people are being judged based on the color of their skin and not the content of their character. So I'm sure you're saying, Mr. Maloof, that's a bunch of hogwash, bullshit, just move on. Well, thank you for asking for me to give you an example. So I represented this young woman in court. Her name, I forget exactly what her name was, but it was something like Chantal Jackson. Clearly an African-American name. So Chantal Jackson, she was 26 years old, never been arrested before, in college, doing well, and she committed the horrific crime of breaking flower pots on her boyfriend's doorstep. So she was mad at her boyfriend and she broke some flower pots. She was charged with felony vandalism. So I'm in the back chambers with the judge, and I'm explaining to the judge, listen, Miss Jackson is 26. She's never been arrested. She's attending college. She broke some, she was mad at her boyfriend. She broke some flower pots. Big deal. Let's reduce it to a misdemeanor and let the misdemeanor attorneys fight it out. Let them fight it out. But she shouldn't be proceeding on as a felony. And the judge looked at me and said, motion denied. Come on, let's go call the case. I was a little surprised. Okay, let's go call. I think the judge asked one question. He asked, what was the price of the flower pots? And I looked at the police report and I said, well, there's no notation about the price of the flower pots. And we all know if you buy the flower pot normally comes free. So these are like a dime a dozen flower pots. All right, motion denied. Let's go call the case. So we go out to call the case, and I get to the podium and I call, line 26. Chantal Jackson, come on up. And up comes a bubbling, blue-eyed, blonde hair white woman. And immediately the judge looks down at the calendar. Then he looks up at Miss Jackson and he says, Chantal Jackson? And she says, yes, that's me. And the judge, this is San Francisco, immediately looks at me and says, oh, Mr. Maloof, I see what you were talking about. I'm gonna go ahead and reduce these charges to misdemeanors. That is a prime example of implicit bias. What changed from the time I argued my butt off in the back chambers? I told him everything. I told him she was a college student. She's never been arrested. Their flower pots are practically free. And he refused. But once he saw what she looked like, then he says, she doesn't look like a felon. And then, and only then, did he reduce the charges to misdemeanors. And if this stuff is going on in the very progressive, I was born and raised in San Francisco, so I'm always going to say San Francisco is liberal and progressive because I'm liberal and progressive. So one of the most progressive liberal cities in the country, if this is going on there, can you imagine what's going on in Alabama, in Tennessee, in Wyoming, in Mississippi? Can you imagine what's going on in the rest of the world? Let me tell another story while I'm at it, since we're talking about the science of implicit bias. Implicit bias, as I said, starts with the police, moves on to the jury, moves on to the judge, and goes all on. So when I say the jury, you're saying, what are you talking about, the jury? There's no implicit bias in the jury. Well, thank you for asking. I'll give you another example. I was representing a 72-year-old man who was a serial rapist. No ands, ifs, or buts about it. He was a serial rapist. But I'm representing him on a homicide. The police believe he was also a serial murderer. No question, a serial rapist, 13 prior rapes. I think that qualifies you rapist. Evidence in the rape homicide where I'm trying him. And we're doing voir dire, we're picking the jury, we're talking about biases, and we're talking about, can you put aside his prior 3 rapes that you're gonna hear about and judge this case? And a white physician raises his hand and says, I would like to talk personally with the judge. Okay, fine. We do that all the time. People come up and speak to the judge all the time. They don't want to say it in front of 200 other jurors. No problem. So I get up and the DA gets up and we start to approach the bench to see what he wants to say. And this white physician turns back and says, no, I just want to talk to the judge personally. Well, it's kind of odd. Doesn't normally happen, but we like, whatever. I go back to my defense table and I hear the doctor tell the judge, I don't like the black guy. So remember, I'm representing a white male. And so when he said, I don't like the black guy, I turned back and I looked to my left and looking at the jurors, and there are no black guys over there. So I turned to my right and I look, there are no black guys over there either. The only black guy he doesn't like is the defense attorney who's representing someone who's clearly a serial rapist and possibly a serial murderer and being charged with murder and rape. And he doesn't like the black guy. So these are just prime examples of the implicit bias. I don't think that was an implicit bias. That was an example of an explicit bias. But we do have to constantly fight biases in the jury system. So as we're talking about jury system, can we hit the next slide, please? So there's a study that showed that defense attorneys are supposed to be the educated people now, right? We're educated. Defense attorneys in death penalty cases paired pictures of white-skinned faces with stereotypically good words, and they paired bad words with black faces. This is a Harvard study. The study also found that 88% of US attorneys are Caucasian, and the vast majority of attorneys have automatic reactions that make associating white with good easier than associating white with bad. You're like, okay, I have no clue what you just said. What are you saying? Thanks for asking. Next slide, please. So this is the study, and I really encourage you guys all to take it just so you know your own implicit bias. Because all of us, every single one of us watching here is saying, I don't have a bias. I don't have a bias. Well, yes, you do. It may not be race, it may be age, it may be sex, it may be religion, but you do have a bias. And once we understand what our biases are, then we can help our clients better because we acknowledge what our biases are and we can try to put that aside. So this study that you see up here, if you just Google implicit bias study, this study will come up. It's a Harvard study. And it would show a picture of, let's say, a face. In this case, it's a black face. And you're supposed to click good or bad. You got you're supposed to do it in 1 second. Everything in 1 second, fast, fast, fast. And in this study, it showed that attorneys that represent death penalty clients, when they see this picture, they're clicking bad more often. When they see a white picture, they're clicking good more often. This study also changes it up. And it would just have a word. And then it would show a picture. So
You're breaking up again, Kwixuan.
Right.
This study.
My internet is.
This study is.
Yes, I see my internet is having problems.
Okay. So this study is it goes through a lot of different types of potential biases, and Harvard. You go on the site and it's free, and they just keep the stats so that they make reports and things on it. Are you free again, Kwixuan?
I hope so. Can you guys hear me now? All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Can we hit the next slide, please? You know, my kids are all on, they're starting today, the high school, so they're on Zoom, and my son is doing college, he's on Zoom, so that's why they're just sucking up my my Wi-Fi, and I can't tell them to get off. So anyway, this slide shows that an all-white jury used 21 minutes to convict a man. And how are juries picked? Juries are normally picked through voter registration and DMV pool. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this slide shows why it's important to have
people of color. It says researchers examined more than 700 felony trials, and this was in Florida, and the conviction rate when there are 0 African Americans in the jury pool, African Americans were convicted 81% of the time. Well, just add 1 African American to that jury pool, it drops the conviction rate for African Americans to 71%, which is just about practically equal to the conviction rate of whites at 63%. So that's why it's very important to have people of color on the jury pool. There's a new assembly bill that's being written as we speak. It's Assembly Bill 3070, and that assembly bill specifically prohibits prosecutors from kicking people off the jury for crazy reasons, like the neighborhood they live in, or they had a bad association with the police, or they have a friend that had a bad association with the police. So this new bill can see this slide clearly shows that they will convict other African Americans, but they would make it more a level playing field. So the question is justice blind? Can we go to the next slide?
Kwixuan, you're stopped again.
Studies have consistently found that everybody is frozen.
No, you're going again.
Okay, good. Here we go. I'm sorry. I keep apologizing. Okay, I'm sorry. Well, let's do this. Let's go to, okay, this is about racial profiling. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that go on in San Francisco. You know, I'm as a defense attorney and, been a defense attorney one way or another for 3 different public defender offices for the last 23 years. Started off in the state public defender's office doing death penalty cases, then Alameda public defender's office, and now San Francisco public defender's office. I see a lot of what's going on in the racism in the police departments, and I am not afraid to call it out. I'm not afraid at all, and I do. And I do all the time. And I remember one judge, ironically, the same judge that reduced Chantal Jackson's felony to misdemeanor, said Mr. Maloof has a 60s mentality towards the police. I proudly said, yes, I do. But I only have a 60s mentality against the police that have a 60s mentality against my client. Oh, what are you saying, Mr. Maloof? There you go again. Well, thank you for asking. Next slide, please. So this is, it's 2011, but not much has changed since 2011 because some of these same police officers are on the force. This isn't a police officer text messaging another police officer. Do you celebrate Kwanzaa at your school? And he responds, yeah, we burn the cross on the field, then we celebrate whiteness. Probably inappropriate for a San Francisco police officer to do that, but it gets worse. Next slide. We got 2 blacks at my boys' school, and they are brother and sister. I'm supposed to say, because their dad works for the school district, and I am watching them like hawks. I if my kids went to that school and I found out that a parent, a police officer, is watching my kids like hawks, I think I'd be a little offended. And why are they watching my kids like hawks? Based on the color of their skin and nothing else, according to this text. But it gets worse. Next slide, please. So this is a series of texts, and it starts off, that says, I hate to tell you, but my wife's friend is over with their kids, and her husband is black. Oh my goodness. Supposed to say he is an attorney, but should I be worried? Fellow officer says, get out your pocket gun, keep it available in case the monkey returns to its roots. It's not against the law to put down an animal. Oh, hold on, wait a minute. Mr. Maloof, you're bringing up something that's in Alabama. No, I'm not. You're bringing up something that's it's in California, but it's gotta be Orange County. No, I'm not. This is San Francisco police officers. And after this officer responds, it's not against the law to put down animals, the fellow officer says, well said. You may have to kill the half-breed kids too. Don't worry, they're an abomination of nature anyway. Wait a minute, you're talking about killing my kids? A San Francisco police officer, you're talking about killing my kids, and you wonder why I have a 60s mentality against these same police officers? That's not a 60s mentality. That's a 40s mentality. That's an 1860s mentality when you're talking about we're having to kill the half-breed kids too. By the way, the officers that against, those exact same officers, not the same department, but the exact same officers were indicted on felonies, and some of them went to prison. And that was the Henry Gate. You guys can all look it up. We all know about it. If you know, it's the Henry Gate Hotel where those officers end up going to prison. Anyway, it goes on. It goes on. As you can see the language, I'm not going to repeat what it says. You can see what it says. And they talk about Yolanda Williams. Yolanda Williams was a high-ranking San Francisco police officer, but these are the type of things that was going on. I said was going on, it's still going on in San Francisco. And I think that's my last slide. Is that my last slide?
Yes, it is, sir.
Yes, so that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I see there were some questions. I didn't have time to read it, but we can go over the questions after Deborah.
Okay, Deborah.
Before I start, there's a second word that you need to issue, Diane, and I don't know what the words are.
Thank you very much. Car.
That is the second word?
Yes.
And I am going to make mine short so that we are done right by 10. We are running overtime. And we will issue certificates that show that we ran overtime for those who are out there attending. My name is Deborah Kemper, and this is way out of my comfort zone. I am going to talk to you about my personal experiences, I would say, over the last 30 years. I'll make them quick. But first, I want to make sure that we're all grounded in the same understanding of how I see racism. And this is a quote from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He said, African Americans have been living in a burning building for many years, choking on the smoke as the flames burn closer and closer. Racism in America is like dust in the air. It seems invisible, even if you're choking on it, until you let the sun in. Then you see it's everywhere. It is everywhere. It affects all aspects of our lives, especially if you're a person of color, even me. We all have biases, but what really matters is what we do with them. My family, when I grew up, didn't talk much about racism. they talked more about fear. They left the South during the Emmett Till era, and they were afraid for their lives, and they moved to Los Angeles. I grew up in South Central. My family owned a 5-bedroom home near USC, and we had our original deed framed in the living room because it said that it could not be sold, the house could not be sold to colored people, and we were very proud that it was. And that was my first touch of racism. I didn't really understand it, but I knew that we were proud homeowners in South Central California. I went to Manual Arts High School in South Central. The school was predominantly Black when I attended. In fact, it was 99% Black. There was one white kid and one Hispanic kid. When my parents went there, when my mother went there, it was all white. And now it's all Hispanic. When I graduated, when I went to Manual, I was a pretty good student. By the time I was in the 12th grade, I had one class and I worked at a furniture store the rest of the time. I had attended summer school all the years I was at school, so I had a lot of credits and I was graduating early. I was actually graduating with honors. And I went into my counselor's office and I said, I want to go to Pepperdine. I had become hooked on beach blanket bingo, and I decided I wanted to go to Pepperdine. And the counselor, who was Caucasian, took one look at me and said, Pepperdine. And she laughed really hard for a long time. And then she said, no, I won't be wasting my time helping you fill out an application for Pepperdine because Blacks don't go there. You should go to Chico or Long Beach State and you'd be fine. Well, I'm stubborn. I was in that baby boomer generation. So I created one application for college and it was to Pepperdine, and I didn't apply to any other school. I was accepted and I went there and I was very excited about going. My first day at school, I arrived early. My grandparents gave me their home, their automobile to go to school. And I was excited. I set up my room and my roommate walked in. She was Caucasian and she came with her father. And I didn't have anyone who brought me to school. I brought myself. And her father took one look at me and he said, oh my God, I can't have my daughter room with a monkey. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the words, but I did have the feelings. It was very hurtful. I sat there and finally he got up and he stormed out of the room and he left me and her in there, and she didn't say anything to me. I didn't say anything to her. About 30, 40 minutes later, he comes back and he tosses me a set of keys. And he says, I couldn't get you a room with anyone else, but I got you a private room. So I had a private room for my first year at Pepperdine, and I couldn't explain that to my grandparents because it was too hurtful. I didn't talk about it at all. In fact, I don't know if I even talked about it until now. I stayed at Pepperdine for 3 years and a law firm came on campus and recruited me off and said that if you come work for us, we will pay for your law school. And I knew I wanted to go to law school, so I left. I worked in that law firm for 18 months and I realized that I didn't want to help defend anyone who hurt children. We had the largest contract for the Los Angeles Unified School District, and we defended a lot of teachers who hurt children. And I remember leaving a sticky on my computer saying, I'm going shopping, and I went to find another job so that I wouldn't be involved in that anymore. I found a job at an accounting firm with 3 men. 2 of them were Jewish. And on my 364th day in the accounting firm, one of the men came in and said, Deborah, I'm tired of seeing your black ass at my front desk. Pack up your stuff and go. And so I walked into the office of the other 2 men and said, I was just fired and I'm leaving. And they said, "Can you just sit here and wait for a moment? We'll go talk to Bob and see what he was thinking." I heard a lot of screaming. I heard a lot of cussing, and I heard a lot of glass breaking. And then the two men came in and said, "Well, you no longer work for Bob, you work for us, and we'll be going on a fishing trip for 30 days. And you have this corner office down the hall." And I was on the 30th floor in Century City. And while they were gone fishing, I was teaching myself how to network. So even though I worked at that CPA firm for 14 years, I decided to go back to school and educate myself. I eventually left the CPA firm and went to the American Heart Association, where I met my current husband. And most of you who do know me on this call know that I'm married to a gentleman named Cliff, and he is Caucasian. This is my second marriage. I have been married twice, once to an African-American man for exactly the same amount of time, 16 years, and to Cliff for 16 years. And I have 5 children, 2 biological children, and 2 foster children, and 1 adoptee child. And I would say that Cliff raised 5 children that he is not biologically linked to, and was an awesome father to all of them, and is continuing to do so. When I started this job at I left the American Heart Association and came to this bar. Within my first 2 weeks, I was called buckwheat at an event that had 150 people there. I was so depressed after that event, I came home and crawled into bed and didn't get out. And it was a Friday night, and by Monday, my husband was asking me, "Why aren't you going to work?" And I said, "You know, I had this experience." I didn't even tell him all weekend. And he said, "You have to go to work and you have to tell your boss what happened." So I went to work. I told my boss what happened, and he said, "You know, I expect somebody would sexually harass you, but not this." And to his credit, he called an emergency meeting of the board and asked for the removal of person who had insulted me. The person who insulted me didn't realize it was an insult. It was what we call a microaggression. Microaggressions are verbal behaviors and environmental slights. Sometimes they happen automatic, sometimes they're unintentional. I do get that. They communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative messages to the people who are receiving them. They do perpetuate a worldview of white supremacy, however, and it's something that I have decided at my 62 years of age that I'm not going to put up with anymore. There are other things that happened during the time that I'm here at this office. I witnessed an attorney swatting one of our staff members on the butt and then denying that he did that. I was in a meeting with a bunch of managers, and I was called a gorilla in the meeting. And I asked the person, "Are you talking to me?" And they said, "Yes, I am talking to you." And it was hurtful. And I literally have not worn my hair twist since then. It was seared into my brain that that was how I was seen. And 3 weeks ago, I visited my home in San Carlos. Our home is under construction. We started our construction around Valentine's Day, and it was supposed to be finished actually Monday. You know, it's not going to be finished until October. But I was going to my home to move out some additional items in my home. And I had asked my friend to distract my husband because I didn't want him involved in removing the additional items, because when we did move out, he hurt his shoulder. And so I had a moving truck meeting me there, and I got there early and I unlocked the gate, and I was moving my car back away from the gate so that my car wouldn't be scratched by the moving truck. And a lady was walking up the hill, and she was out on her morning stroll, and she walked down my gate which, you know, I have a 50-foot driveway. She starts walking down the driveway, and I'm in my car and I'm thinking, who does that? And so I'm looking at her, and she looks around, and then she comes back and she walks up to my car, and she looks in my car window and she says, "Can I help you? You look lost." And I'm shocked, because I wasn't asking for directions. I wasn't looking on my phone at a map. I was sitting in front of my house with my keys in my lap and about to go back in until I saw her walk in. So, and because I had just finished reading White Fragility, I had some words to use. I said, "No, I'm not lost. I look Black, because that's what I am." And she said, "No, no, no, no. People like you come up here all the time and get lost. I was just trying to help you." And so I started to open my car door and explain to her that I've owned this house for 16 years and I know exactly where I am. What was she doing in my yard? And she started to back away and walk down the street. And as she was walking away, she was mumbling something, and I got really nervous. I was worried that she was going to call the police and say that I looked sketchy, or that I didn't belong in the neighborhood, or that I was breaking in my own house. And so I texted a friend who advised me to lock the gate and tell the moving company to blow their horn when they come. I know that there are good people out there, but just like racism, those good people are out there everywhere. And as I said at the beginning of this, it's important to choose what you do with your biases. I have a call to action for everybody who's on this call. I know that everybody wants to be treated with respect. They want to be treated as equals. We all want to be given the same opportunities. We want equity more so than opportunities. And we're definitely going to be seen and heard. You see what's going on in America. I don't have to call that out to you. But you need to continue to educate yourself and learn about microaggressions. Saying things like, "Go back to your country." I wish. This is my country, okay? And telling people to go back to their country is not helpful. It's a microaggression. It's an outright aggression. I am asking my friends to ask clarifying questions when you receive something that happens that could be considered a microaggression. "Excuse me, what do you mean by that?" Interrupt the microaggression. Explore and ask for clarification. And then seek to restore and repair what happened. Say something like, "So, Karen, since you're asking me if I could use help at my house here, yeah, I can. I've been living here. Because you haven't seen me doesn't mean that this isn't my property. Can I help you? Is there anything that I can help you do to understand who I am?" Perhaps I could have invited her in so that she could see that it was mine and I had the key to my own house. But we have got to be better. I'm calling on all of you to be better.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing those personal experiences with us. I know that that's difficult. The final word is television. Now, we had hoped to have time for questions, and we are out of time. But I encourage you again to talk to people in your circle, in your community, and ask questions of those people as well, that they can help you understand what's going on for them and what their experiences are, just like Deborah did.
So thank you, everyone. If you need the 3 words again, Diane will repeat them. If you would like to communicate with us, you can email me and I will make sure your questions get to the people who can address them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Kwixuan.
you all.
Thank you, Deborah. And the words are light, car, television.
Thank you, Diane.
You're welcome.